Let's get started. All right, look, so no notes. I told you last week, and I didn't forget my notes this time. No notes. I told you last week, right? There was some homework assignment for you to start thinking about cultural influences, cultural factors that influence us as Christians today. So I want to have what I hope turns out to be a really in-depth conversation. I want us to take the time and really explore how these different cultural factors, both one, what is the cultural factor, and then second, how does it impact us as Christians? How does that cultural factor either help or hinder our effectiveness in praising God, building the kingdom, bringing others to Christ, all of those kinds of things that we aspire to, but recognizing that there are cultural factors that either help or hinder. Now, I want to set a few ground rules because in just a few minutes, I'm going to stop talking and turn the floor over to all of you. But there are some ground rules. Otherwise, it's going to turn out to be, nothing but the comment section after a Fox News article, which I want to avoid. Let's think about cultural factors that influence us either in helping or hindering us as Christians, either personally in our Christian walk, as Christian parents, as Christian grandparents, as Christian friends of coworkers who may not be Christians, as a church, as Christians who desire to glorify God, all of the ways and all of the roles in which we may operate as a Christian. I want to limit it to that. And there's precedent for that, right? The last 8 weeks we've talked about cultural factors that would have been influencing the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, and how they were then influenced to either obey God and not obey God, and trying to understand the fact that just like we live in our own time, they lived in their own time, right? And they were not living in a vacuum, just like we're not living in a vacuum. So there were influences that, for better or worse, oftentimes as we saw for the worse, influenced them in ways that often drew them away from God, right? So I think that conversations like this are important, and it's, I get it, it's a little different sort of class format than what we're used to just me talking, you listen, that's about it. But I really want this to be an active, engaging conversation with everyone in this room, right? So much so that I'm willing to devote next week to continuing the discussion if we think it valuable to do so. So that's the ground rule, right? It has to be conversations, cultural influences, cultural factors that somehow impact us as Christians for the better or for the worse. And I want it to be specific. I want it to be in depth. I want us all to give ourselves permission to really dig deep into this. All right, let me sort of relay the foundation. I ended last week drawing a conclusion. And I presented it to you in the form of a question. What was the intended culture of the ancient Israelites? And the answer I proposed is it's whatever they chose it to be. And I think that there's a lot of precedent scripturally to come to that conclusion, right? If you just walk through different high points where a decision was made either for the better or for the worse. Eve, for example, chose to sin by eating of the fruit that had been forbidden. Adam chose to follow Eve in that sin. Abraham chose to demonstrate his faith by bringing Isaac for sacrifice, and then God, of course, stopped him in making that sacrifice literally as the knife was raised to take Isaac's life. God then provided the ram to serve as the sacrifice. So Abraham demonstrated his faith by making a choice. We've seen all along how the Israelites demonstrated their faith or not, but they chose to do so. If you go back to the last 2 or 3 chapters in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is making his sort of farewell speech to the Israelites as they are looking across the Jordan River into this land that God has promised. And Moses is giving them this set of farewell thoughts. And Moses wraps up those words by saying, you have a choice. You can either choose the path toward destruction or you can choose life. So from the very beginning, it's always been about the choice that they made. And as we then sort of extrapolate the concept of making that choice to a cultural conversation, it becomes then how did they, and by extension, how should we choose to structure our culture? That is, how should we choose to, what are the foundations we should choose that enable us to hopefully serve God? But I think it's a choice. I think it's a choice. And therefore, it's something that has to be intentional. That's why I wanted to have this conversation as a wrapping up point to our discussions over the last 8 weeks, right? It's an intentional way of thinking about the implications for us right here, right now, real time, real life. So, as a reminder, when we talk about cultural dynamics, kind of a big term, cultural factors, kind of a big term, but it's a simple idea. It's the basic set of values, the basic set of attitudes, the basic set of beliefs that serve as the foundation for the social institutions that get built as a result of those attitudes, values, and beliefs, or the actions taken generally by a group based on how they execute against those attitudes, values, and beliefs. So it's all about the very core attitudes, values, and beliefs. And then from there, how do those attitudes, values, and beliefs, and this is what I want to consider, what are they? Second, how do they either help or hinder us as modern-day Christians in the United States? In whatever form that might take. Again, the easy, obvious points of conversation would be, us as individual Christians, us as a church, Christians as parents, Christians as grandparents, Christians as friends of non-Christians, say in the workplace, the church within the community, Fort Mill, that sort of thing. Any questions, comments? All right. It's just about time for me to be quiet. Question, comment?
Okay. A girl I work with here in Charlotte has friends in the UK, London specifically, and they were afraid to go to church. Yes, it was church pride because they had allowed so many husbands. And this has been 20 years ago. So you and I both know that has not gotten any better. But as a contrast, in the state of Florida yesterday, DeSantis arrested and took off the campus of the Gators, the Palestinians that were causing just
The protesters, yeah.
And why we're allowing that is beyond me because it dramatically affects our culture. But in Scotland, yesterday or the day before, they got rid of a man that they had elected who was heavy with woke ideology. They decided they didn't want that. Also a Muslim. So, back to Abraham. Bad choice, Abraham. We're still waiting.
Okay, hold that thought. My way of saying hold that thought was I'm about to challenge what you just said, right? So it's a way, I don't disagree with anything you just said, right? Recognizing that the protests are going on, some colleges, some states are handling it differently, others are just going in and saying, this is not right, get out. Elected officials get elected, some of which may be more supportive, may help create a culture that's more friendly to Christianity. Others may not, right? Is that the gist of what you're saying? Okay. Here's the challenge. Relate that back very specifically to us. To us. Yeah, so right, that was the point. I don't want this to become the comment section after a Fox News article. I get it. It's happening. But how do we, as Christians, individually and as a church, one, recognize that it's happening? What are the cultural factors driving that? And then how do we engage with those cultural, or based on those cultural factors?
Not to a conflict point, but with Christian ideas that this is not right. And we can't be afraid to speak up.
So we have to be willing ourselves to engage, and we can't be afraid to speak up. All right, so that's the response, right? Put that in terms of a cultural foundation. So for example, do we as a church have a culture, whether we intended or not, which we talked a lot about over the last 8 weeks, the Israelite culture was often very different than what God intended. So is our culture one which is based on fear or timidity, right? That's the cultural foundation. Or are we based on boldness, which would also be consistent with how God intended for the ancient Israelites to live, because he set them in the middle of the ancient world. Remember the maps at the early on, right? We showed the trade routes that literally went through the land of Canaan. It bisected the land of Canaan, north to south. But God placed them there, and I think God intended, we know God intended for them to be, I'm going to borrow the language, a light to that world, right? He intended for them to be different. So is our culture one of boldness or timidity? That's the first question I would ask, kind of based on where I think you're going. If it's boldness, how do we build on that as a positive attribute? If it's timidity, how do we change it?
Well, from what I'm seeing now in states like Washington, state of Washington, San Francisco particularly, I don't believe that they are basing on what you and I would call a Christian culture. They, I hate to say they use the word tolerate, but it seems to be, I mean, San Francisco is all intents and purposes just closed. And they allowed that. So, were they not strong enough? Did they not see what was going on? And, you know, if they don't do anything about it, I guess God will just let them, as he's done in the past. When the Christians got to Rome, what they did to them.
Okay, good start. Good start. I wanted to bring up Harry and Mark had a little thing going at last week, right, where Harry made some comments that made Mark relate it back to a cultural factor, which is one of freedom. Right? And I think most people in this room would agree that one of the basic cultural tenets of the United States is one of freedom. And so now you can start having conversations about how that sense of freedom, that right to freedom, gets manifest either for the better or for the worse. So think about freedom as a basic cultural foundation and how that may impact.
But our own Constitution limits those freedoms to certain things. So just because we have freedom doesn't mean we do anything we want.
So our Constitution limits those freedoms, and just because we have freedom doesn't give us the right to do anything we want.
The parameters that we must acknowledge. And that's no different than what we find in the Bible. God put parameters around things that we can do and not do. So while we have choice, there's still that parameter that we must recognize.
So while we have choice, there are still parameters. So let's pull that through a little further. Bring it specific to Church of Christ at Gold Hill Road, for example.
That's where it gets big.
That is where it gets difficult, right? That's where my job is easy. I get to ask the question and you have to answer it. I've been looking forward to this class for 9 weeks. Come on, Ed, play along. No, it's a really hard question. It's a really hard question. And when you start to, when you're challenged to pull that thread through, that's when all of us sort of look at each other and go, boy, I'm not sure. Here's why I think it's important. I think it's important first, maybe even most importantly, because there's a risk of complacency, which is in part maybe where you were going a little bit, right? People just got complacent. They didn't stand up for what they knew was right. And then because they didn't stand up and challenge when it was early, it became a problem that now is a big, fat, hairy monster that's really, really hard to deal with, right? But complacency is one of the reasons I'm choosing to engage here with all of us. You know, I asked the question last week, why did ancient Israel fall so far away? The Bible, actually, and let me pause with that question. The Bible, I can't see where the Bible says they fell away because. It doesn't neatly answer that question. And it may be because the reason ultimately is not important. The fact is that they did. But we have to live in our times. So understanding some of those whys, I think, is important. Are we complacent? Did ancient Israel choose simply to rebel? Did they have good intentions but never really acted on it? Maybe that's the same as complacency. You know, I don't know. But complacency, I think, is one of the things we're really trying hard to guard against. I've got Jamie and then Josh. Jamie.
Your word complacency. I think that there was a movement that recognized that people of a Christian nature are kind and polite, and they used an emotional argument to silence you and to make you look like you were the bad guy whenever you would question the behavior, right? So as a culture now, we've walked around in a complete circle in Israel, right? If you were someone who was expressing an anti-religious or anti-theocratic attitude, you were shunned. You were maybe stoned, right? There was a huge backlash against you. So the culture that they had was to be reactive against the anti, right? So now we've been shifted, right? Our position has shifted to where we're in a culture that shuns and ostracizes the pro-religious, right? So at some point, I think it wasn't complacency, it was politeness. And now it's not necessarily complacency, it's fear that keeps us quiet.
Okay. So instead of complacency, maybe it's fear. Well, we can certainly have a culture of fear. I mean, a starting point, a foundation of fear as Christians. If we do, shame on us. So what do we do about it?
It's easy to say.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do. You go out and you make yourself a target and you take the ridicule and the suffering, right? Because you're told if you suffer on my account, you'll be blessed, right? But it's easy to say, it's easy to read.
Sure.
It's really hard to enact.
We should. Easy to say, hard to do, though. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Josh.
Yes, sir. I feel like Israel fell away because their focus became less on God and on being more like the world. And the light and the darkness became less distinct and more of the same. So I think the thread, if you will, what we've talked about before and how we pull it through for us is that specifically for our government, right, it exists on a context of Judeo-Christian morality, right? That's the context upon which all of our government was formed. imperfect though it is, and imperfect though our leaders, though they are, there's an objective truth and an objective morality in which the government was originally formed. And we found that it won't last forever, right? The government is not the church. The government is not, not our God, and it will not last forever. America will not last forever, but it is, in my opinion, the most perfect form of government that's ever been formed because of the freedom that you talk about. It allows the freedom of the light to exist inside the darkness without being repressed by any forms of government. Now, is that true in every circumstance through the history of our country, or every circumstance in all of our country now? No. There's some people who very much like to repress Christianity, and there are some people who allow that freedom to exist, for the light to shine as the city, the light to shine in the darkness in the city, to be on the hill is an example for everyone. So our role is to be exactly that, the city that is set on a hill, to be a representative of an objective moral truth, to be a representative of the mystery that has been revealed under the new covenant, the covenant of Jesus and his gospel, to be a representative of that in our form of government, which happens to be the best form of government that has ever existed because it checks and balances freedoms and liberties of the individual and so on. But without that objective morality underneath the government, it collapses in on itself eventually, right? And it will. Not to have a form of like postmodernism there, but we've just seen no human government, like no civilization has lasted for all time. And so that was Israel's problem, and to a good degree, it will be our problem if we as the church allow our light to blend in more and more with the darkness and to become less distinct over time.
So you packed a lot in there. I'm going to try to summarize for the benefit of both those online and across the room. You're recognizing that ancient Israel over time became more and more just like everybody else around them. Their light no longer shined. The light simply was one of many lights in the area. And you're recognizing, I think by extension, we fall to that same risk, right? That we don't look any different. We're no longer that light on a hill. We're no longer in the world, but not of the world. Am I capturing?
Yeah, that's the risk. And our job is to be exactly that light.
Our job is to be different. Our job is to be that light. So the cultural factor there would be one of what? Give me the one word.
We're exclusive from the culture. Independent, we're independent of the culture.
Okay. Yeah, what we should be is independent of the culture. Our culture
Independent of it.
okay, our culture should be one of independence.
At the same time, the morality upon which the church is based should be the context of our entire form of representative government.
Yeah, so that it should be, right? If you look at, if you fast forward, by the time of Christ, the culture of Israel, the Hebrews, right, particularly among the religious elite, had become one of extreme exclusivity, right? So I want to pause there and point out that there's two sides to every coin, and what can be good, freedom, exclusivity in the name of Christ, let me say that differently, exclusivity to the glory of God, maybe is a better way of putting it, but you don't want to be pharisaical, right? Yeah, exactly. Jamie?
You talk about exclusivity. What did Paul say? He said that he became like everybody around him to gain them, right? So we walk out and we say we were going to be in the world but not of the world, kind of meaning we're going to be different, we're going to be bubbled out, right? So we're in our little bubble floating around in this milieu of culture, right? But that's not really what Paul said, was it?
I don't think so. Yeah, I agree. So what is the one-word cultural factor that we're getting at with your comment?
The cultural factor isn't outside culture, it's the inside culture that we need to make sure that we don't crank it to 11 when we go out and be offensive or repulsive to people because we're so weird.
Freedom is what really has caused so much divisiveness even today, because it's resulted in a debate between the ethics and the practice. You do you and I'll do me. So this freedom as a culture has led to so much diversity in what everybody believes. Nobody believes the same thing anymore.
I do, and I'm really trying to, because I have my either thoughts or pet peeves, soapboxes I could get on, and you're almost touching on it. Yeah, I do. But there are two sides to that coin, right? Freedom within boundaries, freedom aligned with responsibility, both of which could be foundational cultural values. We value freedom, we value responsibility. If you combine those two together, that can create a lot of good. But if you take freedom, I think to your point, if you take freedom too far, then you end up with a majority of one across 365 million people, or however many. And that doesn't work, right? At that point, you get into all sorts of conversations about, are we at that point, are we our own God as individuals? Whatever you do you, I'll do me, as you said. Let me ask you, Rodney, did you have?
I think we as humans, God's creation, God gave us some absolutes in His commands. And over time, man has drifted away from those absolutes. And then grace came into play, and we take advantage of that grace. We push it to the extreme. And I think Romans addresses that. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven, for since the creation of the world, we've seen all this." Verse 21 of Romans 1, it says, "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God and give thanks. They became futile, and their speculations and their foolish heart was darkened." And I think that's been a process from the creation of man. We knew God, but we did not honor him as God. And we walked straight further and further away, whether it's a cultural thing, whatever, what you want to call it. But verse 22, I think, kind of nails it. It says, "Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of God, of the incorruptible God for the image and form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed beasts and so forth." Verse 24, "Therefore God gave them over to the lust." So at some point, God gives us over. He's like, they're going to drift that far away. I can't do anything for them. I've given them this, that, the other. The final is grace through his son, Jesus Christ. And I think the bottom line is, we look for those absolutes. The absolute, I think the word you're looking for is truth. What is truth? Because everybody wants to say, well, you have your truth, I have my truth. What is truth? We have it in the written word. Whether we choose to follow that, that's the question.
Okay, so I heard a lot. First key word I heard was grace, I think. We came in with playing on some of the other thoughts, this concept of truth, relative truth, absolute truth. Those are my words, not yours, but I think that summarizes the message. Question for you, right? Give me one or two words, right? Boil all of that down into one or two words that articulate the cultural foundation you want to leave with the group.
Truth.
Truth. And there I think you mean the absolute truth, right? Okay. All right, so truth. You mentioned grace, and if the conversation started to wane, I was going to throw out two or three concepts to get it going again. But they're tied to grace. So as a cultural foundation, where does humility come in? As a cultural foundation, where does pride or where does arrogance come in? You know, if you think about the building of the Tower of Babel, for example, they were building that to make a name for themselves by reaching heaven. That's an activity that is rooted in arrogance, right? That tells us that culturally, one of their cultural foundations was arrogance and pride. I hate to say pride because I think it's more arrogance. So grace, understanding that grace is extended, the acceptance of grace necessarily requires a certain amount of humility, doesn't it? That's the connection I'm making between those two. So I'll throw that out. You know, where do concepts like humility or arrogance, being two sides of the coin, come into play as a cultural foundation? And where would you, it's on a spectrum, in the middle, we've got the humility side, on this side we've got the arrogance side. Yeah, where would we place ourselves? Not where should we, but where do we?
America today, how it prizes individuality. It's not any group thing. It's what I think.
Right. So that's on the arrogant side, certainly. Yeah. 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 Is that contrary to the concept of grace?
Very much so. But that's what we experience today in our culture.
So, arrogance as a cultural foundation hinders us in our Christian walk. How do we guard against it? I mean, think back 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I forget, the conversation we had about in Exodus. It clearly, there's an expectation established that parents teach their children. Right? We talked about that. There was a clear expectation that the king set the moral tone for the nation. Right? So there's this idea of teaching. So that's the stream in which I'm asking the question. How do we deal with these two extremes of arrogance and humility tied in to grace? And I guess better said, how should we, not how do we, but both would be valuable questions.
If we practice what God tells us to do, be loving and kind and humble and be able to cure the people.
Jesus gave us the example that if we are confronted, that we do not react aggressively toward that person, but try to react in a way that is that shows them that we are concerned, but not just get into it.
Right, right. So what comes to mind, Ed, with your statement there is when we start thinking about cultural factors such as arrogance or humility, understanding that we are at risk to being arrogant or prideful also helps us to better understand the starting point, which is we are all sinners. And then I think part to Rodney's point, when we make that realization, right, then our cultural foundation of humility becomes stronger. We're able to react in a way that demonstrates God's love, and we appreciate the grace that's extended. See how all of it fits together.
Then that would cover our humility and the grace that we receive from God.
Yeah, so the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, does cover that. Harry, you.
All right, so I'm going to touch on cultural influence, but I'm going to try to get back to your arrogance and humility. All right, so cultural influence for me was very aggressive. I grew up in denominational work as an apostolic, baptized, Terry, say thank you Jesus 50 times, and then you might get the Spirit. But we were very aggressive, right? We were very aggressive in the neighborhoods. We were very aggressive with the prayer groups. We were very aggressive with bringing speakers out in the middle of the street and kind of taking over the neighborhood to the point where people in that part of where I was growing up, they understood that we weren't tolerating violence on Sunday. That you weren't just walking around during Sunday. Like when you seen, because people walk to church in my neighborhood, a lot of people walk to church, so there was no violence, there was no drug folks, there was not a lot happening Sunday morning through Sunday afternoon. Now Sunday night they were allowed to go to the bar or do whatever they were going to do, but that was the expectation that we kind of put out because we were very aggressive about how we were putting us out. And we didn't take it that you knew something different because we already knew that you believed something different. We simply didn't care. We simply just went out there and said, you're going to lose your soul if you don't do it this way. And we went to the prisons, we went to the corners, we went to where we knew the drug leaders were, and we went out. Because we were already in poverty, so we figured we ain't got nothing to lose anyway, but family, right? So as time goes on, that aggressive nature, to me, feels like, I don't know if I could be as aggressive as I was, because one, man has took it upon themselves to take Sunday, the Lord's Day, as that they don't need that day for the Lord. They need that day for themselves. That day is spent doing bike riding, river rafting, anything that they feel that they want to do. And me, I just look at them like, well, if I get involved, I might run into somebody and they might put me on social media. So I need to be very, very careful about how we evangelize. Let's be meticulous of how we evangelize. So what my cultural influence was when I was a child to a teenager to 20 years old has kind of shifted now that I'm 40. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to be counseled. I don't know if I want to be on somebody's cell phone because I pulled out some speakers and I felt like I wanted to get out a bullhorn or something on the sidewalk. Or looked at as Jamie said, as a crazy person. Right? So, because now I have something to lose. Now I'm all over LinkedIn. Now I don't want to be on X or Twitter or Snap. So, you have to make those decisions. And I think we kind of made those decisions to be a little bit more guarded instead of as aggressive as we used to be. Because America, I'm just talking about America, America as a whole had more respect for "In God We Trust." Now we got rid of "In God We Trust" to is "And I trust," my Bitcoin, my whatever I got going on, and it's the right now, and whatever you got go talk to somebody else. Don't talk to me about that. And that kind of hit my culture, especially as we need to be a little bit more strategic in what we're doing, more intentional. So my key word for this culture is intentional.
Well, yeah. God gave Adam and Eve a choice, right, from the very beginning. Choice is, by definition, choosing one or the other. It's an intentional decision. So, one of the sidebars there to your comment, and I think this is important, I hadn't thought about this, is not just the importance of thinking about cultural factors and how they may influence us as a help or a hindrance, but recognizing that because we do live in a broader world, right? We don't live in a vacuum. We have to be sensitive to the cultural factors that are influencing those around us. And you didn't exactly say that, but I was hearing hints of that in your comment. And I would say the exact word, absolutely. We do. Jamie, you said Paul became all things. I think Paul was being sensitive to those that he was trying to reach. Right?
My point wasn't participate with them in all the bad things they do. It was, don't armor yourself so much that you become offensive to them, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
another word that comes to mind for our current culture is insincere, right? Harry mentioned like Facebook and all of those things, right? We're very guarded in our own personal truths about ourselves, right? And we present something to those around us, right? And I don't think that's what Paul was
sure.
intentionally saying is, hey, go pretend to like them and do the thing, right? That wasn't what he meant either.
Sure. Any other comments?
I think we just need to be very genuine, but at the same time very guarded, but at the same time very compassionate about their situation. Like when we do homeless, whatever, it doesn't mean we go out there flashy and guarded. We go out there with our hearts first, but realizing that it took some time amongst each other to plan this out first, so we can make sure we crossed all of our T's, so we can go out there with the right mindset, with the right compassionate heart, so we don't come off of it as offensive. That way we can say, hey, I became a barbarian to the barbarians, because maybe I don't speak barbarian, but Matt Guy speaks barbarian very well. So he should be the one that starts that conversation, not saying you're barbarian to him.
Okay, let me do a pulse check. We're basically out of time for tonight. I knew it would take us 45 minutes to get to the point where we actually start having the discussion, but I will leave it up to you. Do you want to continue this one more week or move on to something else? Continue? Raise your hand. Move on? All right, it seems like move on's kind of ready to move on. That's fine. I hope the point of tonight, I hope the purpose doesn't get lost. Right? If, for me personally, in trying to facilitate the discussion, if this causes you to pause and think about the influences that are on your life, think about the influences that are on the people around you that you may be trying to share the gospel with. If it causes you to pause and think about how we as a church do things, for better or worse. Right? It all gets back to the basic question of why. Sometimes the motives, cultural factors is almost a synonym for motives. What motivates us to do something? If tonight causes you to start thinking about some of those things, then I will consider it a success. I hope that it has. Thank you for all of your comments. We'll dig into something else next week. Unless there's any other last-minute thoughts, then we'll wrap it up. Very good. Thank you.